Hello again, YouTube. This is Peter with you once again, and today I want to talk about Alex Jones and his being purged from numerous social media sites, and what I think are the broader implications of that. Now, I know a lot of people have already covered the free speech angle, so I'll only touch on that tangentially. But as far as my view of the broader picture, I think that this is something of a watershed moment in the development of social media, and that we've entered a new era. And what exactly that will look like, what shape that will take, it's too soon to tell. But as I look back on the early days of social media and over the last 15 years or so, I can see that in the early phases there was a lot of naivete, not only from the users but from the platforms themselves. And the naivete of the users was the first to go. People used to post things and behave in ways that they really wouldn't now. That's not to say that people's today behavior on social media is exemplary, but let's put it this way. Once you realize that your employers and that the police and your parents and the NSA are basically all looking over your shoulder on social media, you change the way you behave and what you post and all of that. So the first major change was from the actual users of social media. Now we're entering a phase, and it's perhaps overdue, in which the platforms themselves are starting to rethink how they curate content and what they allow to happen on their platforms. And Alex Jones being banned, it may be an overcorrection that's, I don't know, too little too late, or it may be the first step towards a new approach. Again, it's too soon to say exactly what it was, but the real turning points seem to be what people dubbed the YouTube ad apocalypse, in which the advertisers who were using YouTube and Facebook and other platforms suddenly realized that their advertising content could be matched with just about anything. And so suddenly there was a complete turnaround of how they did advertising, who was allowed to put advertisements on their videos. And of course, next major thing was the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. And honestly, I'll probably do a video on that in the near future, because let's face it, governments have been interfering in each other's elections for a long time. In the early stages of the Cold War, in the immediate post-war era, in countries like Italy and Greece, let's just say that there were CIA agents with duffel bags full of money trying to sway elections in places like Italy and other parts of Europe. This is not exactly something new. Not only that, but in terms of trying to influence public opinion, certain political groups, albeit domestic ones, that's their entire purpose. Again, this is a subject for a completely separate video. But as a reaction to this, with Mark Zuckerberg being called on the carpet in front of Congress, and the fallout of that, social media sites are suddenly trying to say, okay, previously we just basically let just about anyone post just about anything. The really only major restriction, aside from copyright, was pornography. So copyrighted material and pornography before were their enemy. But now they're trying to wade into more politically based content without coming off as censors. Now, Alex Jones was an easy target. Even I've made videos criticizing Alex Jones. I really don't have any love for the guy. I would go even further and say that Alex Jones got to where he got because of social media. Now, I'm old enough to remember a world before all of social media, and although Alex Jones was around, and there was conspiracy theories and all of this, it just did not have the sort of impact and reach that it did prior to social media. Now, that should be obvious, but at the same time, it's easy to overestimate. prior to social media and YouTube and things that allowed him to get his message out, he was basically a Austin-based public access television figure who was an obscure figure on America's cultural fringes. And although I may sound like, you know, a condescending old man who's going to be like, let me tell you about back in my day, I don't mean to condescend to you, but it's worth looking back at what the world was like before social media, the days of old media, as it's called. And people bandy about this term, the mainstream media, but back in the day, that used to be a real thing, because first you had basically only a handful of channels on television, and then you had cable, which expanded the spectrum a bit more, and then you had social media, which pretty much everyone can participate in who's wealthy enough to afford the basic technological means. But even as far back as the 90s, 20 years ago, there were gatekeepers of who was allowed to participate in media because there were high barriers to entry when it was broadcast or cable. And these barriers to entry were a hell of a lot higher than a computer, an internet connection, a high-speed internet connection preferably, and a webcam. And of course today, if you want to make it on YouTube, you have to have a somewhat more expensive setup than that. Right now I'm using several $100s worth of equipment, and it's not even all that good, to say nothing of the computer that I spent about $2,000 on. So it's not that there are not barriers to entry today. It's just that they weren't a mile high. They're you know, 5 feet high. It's a fence that most people can climb over rather than being a mile high the way they were even 20 years ago. And this wide access has given not only people like Alex Jones, people like myself, people like whoever, a platform and a voice, but that was basically the business strategy, is let just about anyone post just about anything, gain lots of views, put ads on that, make money off the advertisements, and very little thought was given to the actual content itself. What is being said by whom? Once they started to wise up and say, hey, wait a minute, these people are making these videos and this company doesn't want to be associated with these sorts of videos, and this foreign government is doing this on this platform and this platform and this platform to influence this election and so on, suddenly they started to have to wise up. And I don't think they've quite figured out what they're going to do about all of this, because for one thing, there's simply too much content to have the kinds of censorship and filtering and gatekeepers that old media had. And we can look at other moments in time in American history as parallels, but I'm not sure how useful they are given the volume of content today. So in the relatively early phases of film, it wasn't entirely a free-for-all. There was a certain sense of good taste within bounds, but even that pushed things a bit too far for the times. And in the early 30s, you had what became known as the Hays Code. And this was a selective form of censorship where the studio said, we're going to abide by certain guidelines in what we put into movies. About 20 years later, you have the Comic Code Authority after another moral panic about the content of comic books. And that's, of course, is a fairly famous episode in the history of American media. There's a good book about it called The 10-Cent Plague, talking about the moral panic over comic books and the formation of the Comic Code Authority. And, of course, there were certain overreactions and moral panic. Certain things became sacrificial lambs, like horror comics, for example, or Catwoman disappearing from the pages of Batman for about 16 years or so because she violated all sorts of aspects of the comic code guidelines by basically making crime look sexy. But then things settled down into a new normal, and it didn't quite go into full-blown worst-case scenario censorship. And slowly, over the course of decades, the control and the influence of these regulatory systems started to break down, and then you see them in the 70s and 80s get darker and grittier and all that. This isn't a thing about the history of comics and film. Suffice to say, if you're interested in that, you can look it up for yourself. You might already be familiar with it. But I don't think, although there is a certain amount of parallels that we can draw to as moments where it's like, hey, this comic book people being forced to testify in front of the Senate is sort of like Mark Zuckerberg going in front of the Senate and talking about social media. There's parallels there, but I don't think they're going to be able to say, okay, we want to make movies and comics that don't include X, Y, and Z, because that will never work for social media. You still, by and large, have broad and vague guidelines, and every now and then they say, hey, wait a minute, this guy that's become quite popular, but also a public nuisance from certain people's point of view, he's technically violating our vague guidelines, so let's ban him from our site. So that's one potential path forward for them, is to simply play whack-a-mole with whatever content creator gets on their radar that they feel they need to take down this week. Of course, there's the possibility that they will further try to refine their algorithms, but I'm skeptical of that on a number of levels. Not only on a technical level, but also my experience and what I've observed thus far has not led me to have any faith in the ability of algorithms to decide what content is, quote, objectionable or whatever. And if they start leaning on that, it will probably just create a disaster. But not to sound overly cynical here, but at the very least, YouTube has shown very little regard for its content creators. And this is a long, long story going back well over a decade. I can think of numerous cases of how people have complained constantly about how the flagging system has been broken, about how the content ID system has been broken. And imagine applying those things to something like terms of service, which their terms of service are vague, or what sort of content is allowed or versus not allowed, and to say absolutely nothing of the ideological and political implications of what sort of speech and point of view they're going to decide this week is not favorable. So again, I'm not saying they won't try and lean heavier in that direction, but if they do, it's not going to work out very well, and it's going to further alienate the content creators. That being said, though, it is something of a privilege to be able to post content at all. And I don't mean that in some social justice, white privilege sense. I mean that the servers and other infrastructure that goes into making video sharing possible is quite expensive, and for much of YouTube's history, it basically bled money. I mean, by that I mean, imagine that scene from The Shining where the elevator doors open and just gushes out blood. That's the kind of bleed money we're talking about from YouTube, and they've slowly tried to put the site into the black. So anyone's attempt to build some sort of YouTube alternative would require them to have a vast amount of startup capital. And people who have vast amounts of money to invest in something usually want to reap profit from that investment. So they're likely to get into the same sort of scenario as YouTube, where they have to cater to the people giving them money, i.e. the companies who are paying them for ad revenue, over the actual content creators. There's a reason that the YouTube ad revenue apocalypse happened. It's because in terms of their business, they need to cater to Coca-Cola and McDonald's and Walmart more than they need to cater to Johnny Race Realist angered that he can't make money over his racist videos anymore. So for the time being, my thought is that the platforms are going to be fumbling around, trying different things and seeing what works and what doesn't. It's kind of an experimental phase of figuring out how they're going to deal with this new era of social media, and how it will all play out. Again, it's too soon to tell all of that. But as far as the content creators, especially on YouTube, because we've dealt with this crap from YouTube for the last decade or more, and there has been a period of adjustment with every major thing that's come along on YouTube. The content creators have either quit or evolved and learned to cope with whatever it was. That's why you've seen a lot of content creators shift towards Patreon instead of ad revenue, because the ad revenue system, it was never all that good to begin with, but it's completely broken now. And you've also seen people trying to change their strategy about what sort of video they create. A lot of people freaked out that their videos were going to be blocked if they said the wrong thing, videos being demonetized, all of that. The actual rank and file content creators have been dealing with that for a long time and adapting to it. So where it goes next is anybody's guess. But any would-be content creator would do well to keep in mind that these platforms are not a public service, in spite of the fact that they've become integral to our social and political system. They're still privately owned corporations here to make a profit off of your content and your use of the site and monetizing your eyeballs. And the most likely path that they're going to travel for the immediate future is that you're relatively safe in obscurity, but if you reach a certain critical threshold where you get on their radar, as Alex Jones does, and you become a problem, then they can and probably will ban you. So what that means, what the outcome of that is, again, we can only speculate, but I don't think that we've seen the end of this new phase. And that's all I have to say for right now. Give me your thoughts in the comments section, and have a good whatever time it is.